You're locked inside a stone cell beneath the greatest arena ever built. Above your head, 50,000 Romans have just watched your husband die fighting a lion. The crowd is already leaving. Sandals scrape against stone. Torches are being extinguished one by one. The noise fades into a dull echo. Then you hear it. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Getting closer. A shadow stretches across the doorway. A man steps into the light. It's the gladiator who survived today's massacre. His armor is dented. His body is stray with blood that isn't his own. A guard follows behind him, keys clinking softly. The lock turns. The door opens. The gladiator points at you. This isn't a horror movie. This was Tuesday in the Roman Empire. What I'm about to show you is the part of Roman history they don't teach in school. The part that happened after the cheers stopped and the crowds went home. A systematic state-sponsored nightmare that only began when the arena went quiet. This isn't speculation. Roman writers described it themselves. And the evidence is carved into the walls beneath the Colosseum. Stay with me until the end, and you'll never look at ancient Rome the same way again. Hollywood has lied to you about gladiators for decades. Films like Gladiator and Spartacus show blood, honor, rebellion, defiance. They show men dying under the sun, swords raised, crowds roaring. What they don't show is what happened in the hours after the games ended, when the spectacle turned inward, when entertainment became something darker. I'm talking about a system so disturbing that modern historians had to invent a new Latin term to describe it. Victoria carnalis, the carnal victory. The Romans never called it that. To them, it wasn't shocking. It didn't need a name. It was just how things worked. Here's what we know for certain. Roman writers like Martial, Juvenal, and Seneca describe a world where conquered women were stored beneath arenas and distributed as prizes. Not symbolically, literally handed out like rations to gladiators who fought well. This wasn't the work of rogue individuals or corrupt guards. The Roman state itself ran this system. The same government that engineered aqueducts and roads also engineered the logistics of sexual violence. Think about that. The civilization that gave us concrete law and representative government also perfected the industrialization of human suffering. Before we go any further, pause for a moment. Look at the like button. If you believe hidden history deserves to be exposed, even when it's uncomfortable, hit it. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. Because this story isn't just about Rome. It's about what empires do when no one is watching. Now, let's descend into the Hippoem. To understand what happened in those underground chambers, you first have to understand how Rome turned human beings into inventory. This wasn't random cruelty. It was systematic dehumanization carried out on an industrial scale. And it began the moment Roman legions conquered new territory. When Rome crushed a rebellion in Gaul or annihilated a city in Judea, they didn't just win a battle. They processed an entire population. Men of fighting age were sent to die in mines or arenas. Children were sold into slave markets across the empire. Women were labeled captiva, war prizes that belonged to the state. And here's where it becomes truly chilling. Under Roman law, these people were no longer legally human. They were classified as re things property, the same legal category as furniture or livestock. A conquered woman had no more rights than a chair. You could do anything to her. And it wasn't legally a crime because you can't commit a crime against an object. But Rome didn't rely on law alone to enforce this reality. It relied on spectacle. The games weren't just entertainment. They were political theatre designed to dominate the conquered and condition Rome's own citizens. When you watched a captured Germanic chieftain torn apart by a lion, you weren't just seeing a man die. You were watching Rome demonstrate what happens to those who resist. And during the midday lull when the elites left for lunch, that's when things became truly sadistic. Historians call these events fatal charades, mythological reenactments where condemned prisoners were forced to act out famous legends. Except the deaths were real. Martial, writing in the 1st century AD, describes these scenes with disturbing casualness. He writes like a food critic reviewing a meal. In one account, a prisoner is dressed as Orpheus, the legendary musician who could charm any creature with his song. He's led into the arena holding a lyre. Then they release a bear. Marshall notes, almost with disappointment, that this time the music didn't work. The bear mauled the man to death while 50,000 spectators snacked on honeyed dates. In another passage, and I need to warn you, this is deeply disturbing, Marshall describes a woman forced to reenact the myth of Pasiphae, who mated with a sacred bull. For this prisoner, the reenactment meant being publicly assaulted by an animal in front of thousands of people until she died from her injuries. Read that again. The Roman state created a system where human beings were raped to death by animals as lunchtime entertainment. This wasn't the fantasy of a single mad emperor. It went on for decades. Senators brought their children, vendors sold snacks, events were advertised on city walls, and Marshall praises it. He writes, "Whatever myth tells, the arena makes real." He meant it as a compliment. This was the environment, the bureaucratic industrial machinery of cruelty that also turned conquered women into rewards for gladiators. Now we need to talk about the men who received those rewards. Gladiators existed in a contradiction Rome never resolved. They were slaves with less legal status than a dog. Yet they were celebrities. Their faces appeared on mosaics. Their names were scratched into walls by adoring fans. Women of the aristocracy were obsessed with them. Graffiti in Pompeii calls one gladiator the sigh of the girls, and another the glory F the ladies. Noble women snuck into gladiator barracks, bribing guards for private encounters. One gladiator, Sergius, reportedly had affairs with multiple married patrician women, causing public scandal. Even their sweat was commodified. After fights, gladiators were scraped down, their sweat mixed with olive oil, and sold as an aphrodisiac and beauty treatment. Think about that. Enslaved men owned by the state whose bodily fluids were bottled and sold to the elite. And yet Rome was terrified of them. The Spartacus rebellion of 73 BC haunted the Roman psyche. 78 gladiators escaped, raised an army of 70,000, and nearly destroyed the Republic. For 2 years they crushed legion after legion. When Rome finally won, they crucified 6,000 survivors along the Ion Way. One body every 40 meters. A forest of crosses stretching for 200 kilometers. That trauma never faded. Every gladiator holding a sword was a reminder that these men had once come terrifyingly close to burning Rome to the ground. So the question was simple. How do you control incredibly dangerous, highly trained men with every reason to rebel? You reward them carefully, strategically. Extra food, prize money, the promise of freedom after enough victories, and something else. Something the sources mention only in passing, as if it were too obvious to explain: access to conquered women. The documentation is scattered, frustratingly vague. Roman writers don't dwell on it. But when you piece together references from Martial, Juvenal, and later historians, a pattern emerges. After major games, especially those funded by emperors or powerful senators, victorious gladiators were granted what sources call the privileges of the victor. Modern historians believe this often meant access to female captives held beneath the arena. And that's where we're going next. Because the real horror didn't happen on the sand, it happened underground. The process was cold, efficient, almost administrative. After a particularly brutal match, a gladiator who survived and impressed the crowd wouldn't return directly to his barracks. Instead, still wearing his armor, still caked in blood and sand, he would be escorted downward into the Hippo, the vast underground network beneath the arena floor. Oil lamps flickered along the tunnel walls. The air smelled of iron, sweat, and animal waste. They passed cages where lions paced in the dark. Mechanical lifts creaked softly, ready to raise the next spectacle to the surface. This part of the arena was invisible to the crowd above. That was the point. An arena official or lanista representative walked ahead, clipboard in hand, not metaphorically. A wax tablet, names, numbers, property inventories. They stopped at a section of holding cells most spectators never knew existed. These weren't ordinary prison cells. Archaeological excavations beneath amphitheaters across the empire. Capua, Pompeii, Putti, even beneath the Colosseum itself, have revealed small stone chambers with distinctive unsettling features. Stone benches built at a precise height, iron rings anchored into the walls, some near the floor, others at waist level, some higher. Doors reinforced with iron that lock from the outside. In several chambers, chains are permanently mounted into the stone, part of the architecture itself. These rooms weren't improvised, they were designed. The women held inside were called captivi damni, condemned war captives. They had already been processed through Rome's bureaucracy of conquest. Officials known as commentari recorded them in ledgers as state property. Each woman was assigned a number, a category, an origin. Germanica, Britannica, Parica, human beings reduced to labels. The gladiator would be shown a row of cells. Some accounts suggest he could choose, others imply the assignment was made for him, like equipment being issued from a storehouse. Either way, a guard unlocked the designated door. Sometimes the woman was brought out, sometimes the gladiator was pushed inside. Then the door was locked again. What happened next is never described in explicit detail by Roman writers. They didn't need to. The architecture tells the story. This wasn't considered a crime. It wasn't even controversial. It was a line item in the operational budget of the games. The logistics of Victoria Carnalis were handled by the same administrators who scheduled animal fights and repaired arena machinery. From the state's perspective, the system was elegant. It rewarded loyal gladiators without granting real freedom. It cost almost nothing. Conquered women were already classified as spoils of war, and it reinforced the core message of Roman power. Victory means access. Dominance means ownership. One Roman writer quoted by later historians summarized it bluntly. The victor claims his prize as the empire claims its provinces by right of conquest. Now, we need to talk about the spaces where this happened because the archaeology is impossible to ignore. When excavations beneath the Colosseum began in the 19th century, researchers focused on engineering marvels. The elevators, trapdoors, and tunnels that made the games possible. But as work continued, something else emerged. Rooms that didn't fit. These chambers were small, typically 10 to 15 square meters. They were isolated from animal cages and gladiator preparation rooms. They served no obvious logistical purpose, except one. The benches weren't for resting. They were too narrow, too deliberately placed. The iron rings were positioned at multiple heights, as if designed for different restraints. And the walls. In several chambers, archaeologists found scratch marks etched deep into the stone, desperate fingernails, repeated attempts to claw through solid rock. The historian Cases Dio, writing in the 3rd century AD, mentions that beneath major amphitheaters were chambers for those awaiting their use. The phrasing is vague, but the context is revealing. He's discussing game logistics, human resources. But the most haunting evidence comes from graffiti. In the high poem beneath the amphitheater at Capua, the same city where Spartacus began his rebellion, archaeologists found inscriptions scratched into cell walls. Some are in Latin, others in Celtic languages. Many are fragmentary, a few are legible. One reads roughly, "I was Aemilia of the Brigantes. I saw my children killed. Now I am nothing." Another written in broken script, "To any god who hears, let me die before tomorrow." These voices don't appear in Roman histories. Emperors and generals get names. Victories get monuments. But the stones remember what the chronicles ignore. And the architecture tells us something crucial. This system was built for repetition. These weren't secret rooms created by corrupt guards. They were standardized facilities designed, maintained, and replicated across the empire. Just like gladiator barracks, just like animal pens, just like weapon storage, the captive chambers fit the same pattern. This was state-sponsored infrastructure for systematic abuse. Some historians argue we shouldn't read too much into this, that these rooms could have served multiple purposes, that we're projecting modern horror onto ancient evidence. But when you combine the architecture with literary references, Roman military culture, and basic logic about how the games functioned, the picture becomes unavoidable. Now we have to confront the hardest part of this story. What this meant for the women trapped inside that system. History is almost silent about their individual experiences. We don't have diaries, we don't have testimony. What we have are ledgers listing them as inventory. Female Germanic approximately 20 years, good health assigned to Colosseum holding, but we can reconstruct the nightmare. These women weren't random prisoners. They came from moments of absolute devastation. When Rome crushed resistance during the Dacian Wars, or the suppression of the Britannic revolt led by Boudicca, the aftermath followed procedure. Men were killed or enslaved for labor. Children were separated and sold to distant markets. Women of childbearing age were chained together and transported as captive. For a woman in that position, the journey to the arena was already a descent through hell. You watched your village burn, you saw your children torn from your arms, you were marched hundreds of miles in chains, you were stripped, examined, numbered, then you were locked beneath the greatest monument of the civilization that destroyed everything you knew. The waiting was torture. You could hear everything. The roar of the crowd above as people like you were executed for sport, the screams of animals, the cheers when a gladiator landed a perfect killing blow, and you knew you would never leave. There was no ransom, no exchange. Rome didn't negotiate with the conquered. Your family would never know what happened to you. You simply vanished into the machinery of empire. Then came the footsteps, the door opening, the selection, the lock turning again. Roman law offered no protection. You weren't legally a person. Suicide, sometimes seen as an honorable escape in Roman culture, was forbidden. Destroying state property was a crime. Even in death, your body would still be used. This was psychological warfare on a civilizational scale. The humiliation of conquered women wasn't a side effect of Roman policy. It was the point. Ancient sources make this explicit. After crushing the Jewish revolt in 70 AD, the historian Josephus records that Roman authorities deliberately distributed Jewish women among the legions and the games. Not randomly, deliberately. The message to survivors was clear. You have lost your land, you have lost your sovereignty, and you have lost the ability to protect your families. Resist Rome. And this is what happens to your daughters. But occasionally the system cracked. For all its cruelty, Rome was obsessed with its self-image. It believed it brought order and civilization to the world. Some horrors had to remain hidden to maintain that illusion. Which brings us to an uncomfortable disruption. Female gladiators, they were rare, but they existed. Ancient sources disagree about who they were. Some were enslaved women forced to fight. Others appear to have been nobles who, in a society that gave women almost no power, sought a twisted form of agency and fame in the arena. Their existence scandalized Rome's elite. The satist juveniles sneered. What sense of shame can exist in a woman who wears a helmet? In 200 AD, Emperor Septimius Sais attended games in Antioch that featured female fighters. Cassius Dio was there. Something unexpected happened. The Greek audience reacted with solemnity, treating the women like male gladiators, but the Roman spectators jeered. They shouted sexual comments. They turned the event into a vulgar joke. The women weren't seen as warriors, they were seen as sexual spectacle. Sais was reportedly mortified not by the violence, but by how openly Rome's cruelty revealed itself. The illusion cracked, so he banned women from fighting in the arena, not to protect them, but to push the violence back into the shadows. Because the abuse never stopped. It just returned to the darkness beneath the arena, where it had always truly lived. The ban didn't mark a moral turning point. Nothing was fixed. Nothing was reformed. The machinery simply kept running out of sight. The games continued for generations. Even after Rome officially converted to Christianity in the 4th century AD, gladiatorial combat didn't immediately end. Emperors issued half-hearted restrictions. Bishops complained. Crowds kept coming. The last recorded gladiatorial fight took place in 404 AD. A monk named Telemachus jumped into the arena trying to stop a duel. The crowd didn't cheer his courage. They tore him apart. Only after his death. Did Emperor Honorius finally ban gladiatorial combat outright? But even that didn't dismantle the system beneath the arenas. The hippoimum remained, the holding chambers remained, the practice of taking war captives remained. Throughout the Byzantine period, conquered populations were still processed, categorized, and distributed. The infrastructure outlived the games themselves. The system didn't end because Rome grew more ethical. It ended because Rome collapsed. When the empire fractured, the machinery of conquest broke down, borders fell apart, legions stopped marching, and without constant expansion, the supply of captives dried up. The institution died not from moral awakening, but from logistical failure. Today, millions of tourists walk through the Colosseum every year. They take photos beneath towering arches. They admire the engineering. Guides talk about gladiators, lions, emperors, spectacle. Very few mention what happened underneath. The rings bolted into the walls are still there. The benches are still there. The scratch marks are still there, preserved beneath centuries of dust. The ledgers that recorded human beings as inventory still exist too. Stored in museums and archives across Europe, anyone can read them. This wasn't rumor, it wasn't isolated abuse, it was policy, it was infrastructure, it was normal. The Colosseum stands today as a monument to what empire actually means, not just architecture and victory parades, but the industrialized horror required to maintain absolute dominance. Every stone in that arena was paid for with more than money. It was paid for with lives deliberately destroyed, quietly, efficiently, and repeatedly. The spectacle on the sand was only the part Rome wanted remembered. The rest happened in the darkness beneath your feet, in the silence after the crowd went home. Those voices, the ones Roman chroniclers didn't bother to record, are still there, carved into stone if you're willing to listen. And that is the history they don't teach in school. If this revealed something you'd never heard before, subscribe and turn on notifications. We're going to keep uncovering the stories empires tried to erase. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next investigation into the darkest corners of the way.